An Introduction to Europe, from Late Antiquity to the Middle Ages, a podcast by Dr. Arpaia. Before we begin, let me introduce two basic historical terms. Late Antiquity is a period that corresponds approximately to a period that began in the 4th and ended in the 8th century CE. The Middle Ages overlaps with Late Antiquity and corresponds approximately with a period that began in the 5th century and ended in the 15th century. Please note that the adjective form of the Middle Ages is medieval. All terms are capitalized when writing about history. Next, I want to recall that in ancient times, the Mediterranean basin was divided along a north-south axis into an eastern and a western half. The Roman Empire was divided culturally in a similar manner. By late antiquity, that geographic and cultural divide became political. This political division had begun before the reign of Constantine, but his transfer of the capital from the city of Rome in the west to the city of Constantinople in the east strengthened this political divide. The area centered on the city of Rome became known thereafter as the Western Roman Empire, whereas the eastern half was still called the Roman Empire because the leader in Constantinople ruled over both halves. The emperor in the west, as he was sometimes called, was chosen by the leader in Constantinople to serve as the administrator of the western provinces. Western historians would later devise the name Byzantium, or the Byzantine Empire, for what remained of the Roman Empire after the western half fell. The empire began to decline in the 3rd century with the arrival of waves of Germanic tribes. You will notice that only one Germanic invasion directly affected the eastern half, which is why it remained stronger than the western half and continued to survive into the 15th century. We refer to these tribes as Germanic because they came from an area the Romans called Germania. Sometimes the Germanic people were forced westward into the Roman Empire by other tribes further east from Asia. Other times, Germanic tribes came as raiders, attacking Roman settlements along the border before returning back to Germania. Still others immigrated peacefully in search of a better life and settled with Rome's permission. Germanic tribes shared many similarities, but they were distinct one from another, and normally did not get along well together either. They were very different from the Romans, and the Romans looked down on them, calling them barbarians, a derogatory term invented from what the Germanic languages sounded like to Roman ears. When the Germanic tribes came peacefully, the Romans exploited them. They invited Germanic tribes to settle along the western border, where most Roman citizens did not want to live, and where friendly tribes could serve as a buffer against invasions by unfriendly ones. Roman officials had the Germanic tribes clear new land, thus expanding the agricultural potential of the western provinces and enriching Rome. Germanic men also provided much-needed recruits for the Roman legions in late antiquity. Over time, increasing tensions between the Germanic peoples and the Romans eventually led to wars that further weakened the authority of the Roman Empire in the western provinces. In the 5th century, the Germanic people became so strong that whole tribes began taking over the western provinces. Not even Rome was safe. Indeed, it was sacked 3 times in the 5th century. First by the Visigoths in 410, then by the Vandals in 455, and finally by the Ostrogoths in 476, who put an end to Roman rule in the west. Roman citizens everywhere were shocked by these attacks on Rome, even though the city had lost its status long before the Ostrogoths sacked the city. Indeed, the slow decline of the city of Rome had become so bad that, by the end of the 4th century, the emperors in the west had already moved the western capital to other cities, where the infrastructure was better and where the emperors were relatively safe from hostile Germanic armies. As you might expect, recurrent political strife in late antiquity disadvantaged Mediterranean trade in favor of local trade, and loosened the economic ties that had bound the Roman Empire together since the 1st century CE. In the western provinces, which bore the brunt of disruption, burgeoning local economies strengthened new, local political structures at the expense of centralized power. Roman society also felt the impact of these disruptive forces. Social stagnation occurred in both halves of the empire. Social mobility declined as the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. Families of citizens and freemen monopolized the trade. Most occupations became increasingly hereditary. Late antiquity was also marked by the rise of an aristocracy of landowners and military officials. These elites controlled fortified cities and newly fortified country estates. These agricultural estates had been worked by slaves and freemen for centuries. As the economy soured in late antiquity, poor Roman citizens and freemen increasingly sought work there and became dependent on the new elites. These citizens and freemen slowly began to lose their social standing and were forced to bind themselves to the service of the aristocracy for jobs and protection. The Western Roman Empire also contracted and disappeared in late antiquity. As Rome's power in the West broke down, Africa was lost to barbarians. What remained were the Iberian Peninsula, the British Isles, parts of Western Europe, and the Italian Peninsula, until by the end of the 5th century, even these areas fell under the control of Germanic leaders. Roman officials were forced to accommodate them or face being overthrown. One result of this historical process in the former Western Roman Empire was the construction of a hybrid Roman and Germanic culture. With the Western Roman Empire gone, elite contemporaries increasingly spoke about themselves as living in Europe, after the name of the continent where the Western Roman Empire had been mostly located. This Europe of late antiquity became the foundation of medieval European culture. The further one went south in medieval Europe, the more the areas retained a Roman stamp. The further north, the more the areas gained a Germanic influence. Christian leaders took a leading role in preserving Roman culture and fusing it with Germanic culture. They became an educated elite as Rome declined and Europe rose from its ashes. Bishops took over the administration of cities and estates. The clergy assumed the role of the old Roman civil service. The Christian clergy in the West increasingly referred to itself and its culture as universal, or Catholic in Latin. As clerical power spread across what used to be the Western Roman Empire, it created a pan-European culture squarely in the hands of an ascendant Catholic organization. The focal point of Catholic politics and culture was the city of Rome. Although the city had lost its status as the capital of the Roman Empire, the city's association with the Christian leaders Peter and Paul created the basis for the supremacy of the Bishop of Rome in the eyes of many Christian believers. Peter and Paul had each moved to Rome in the 1st century CE, and, according to Catholic tradition, had assumed in turn the leadership of the Christian community in the city. Both were martyred there for their faith. As a consequence, the city became the most important destination for Christian pilgrims, especially for ones living in the western provinces, because travel to Jerusalem was more distant and dangerous than travel to Rome. Later bishops of Rome claimed to be the heirs to the two saints, and thus to sole leadership over Christianity. Christian leaders in the western half of the Roman Empire began to call their organization the Roman Catholic Church, a name that emphasized the universality of their brand of Christianity and the primacy of Rome, even though the cities in the eastern Mediterranean had older Christian communities and a closer association to Jesus and his disciples. The Bishop of Rome became known during this period of transition from late antiquity to medieval Europe as the Pope, from Papa, the Latin word for father. To augment his claim as the supreme leader of Christianity, the Pope assumed the title of Pontifex Maximus, a title that Augustus Caesar had claimed as his own in the 1st century CE, as had every emperor afterwards. The title in Latin meant high priest. For Christians, it additionally recalled the chief Jewish priest in Jerusalem, who also held the title of high priest, except in Hebrew. The Jewish high priest used to preside over the temple until its destruction in 70 CE, whereupon the Jewish title of high priest had ceased to exist. By appropriating the title of Pontifex Maximus, a title still used by the Pope today, Catholics made the claim that their leader replaced both the Caesars and the Jewish high priest, and that the Roman Catholic Church was the one true heir to the legacies of both ancient Rome and the Jews as the new chosen people. Thereafter, as the popes became kings in their own right, the Catholic Church and its leaders constructed a Catholic Europe that still occupies a central role in world history. Despite papal claims, the primacy of the papacy was never accepted in the Eastern Roman Empire or by the people living in the successor states, even to the present day. Next, let's turn to the emergence of medieval Europe. While a close examination of Europe during this period would reveal a great deal of change, it is still possible to consider it as a single block of time. The Roman Empire in the West fell when the last emperor in Rome was forced to abdicate in 476. Contemporaries began to talk about a Europe, and a Christian or Catholic Europe, consisting of the successor Germanic states to the Western Roman Empire and later Christian areas on the continent. Still, it is important to point out the continent of Europe was much larger than medieval Europe. The dominant socio-economic form over the next 800 years was called feudalism. Feudalism was a socio-economic system with political and cultural consequences, which we will consider briefly in this podcast. Feudalism produced most of the wealth in Europe during the Middle Ages. It was based on agricultural production. The basic unit of feudalism was the manor. Medieval manors were closed socioeconomic systems that were controlled either by a single head of a household or by a communal group. If controlled by a single head of a household, the person was a wealthy man or woman whose family would later claim a title of nobility and was called the lord of the land. We get the modern-day word landlord from this feudal term. If the manor belonged to a noble family, the lord of the land got control of the land from a more powerful warrior nobleman in a ceremony imbued with Catholic symbolism. If we were to diagram the political structure of feudalism, it would be like a giant pyramid. At the apex of the period was the Germanic chieftain, who had control over a large territory. To more effectively control the large territory, he apportioned parcels of land among his most powerful warriors in return for their political loyalty. These powerful warriors owed their allegiance to the chieftain and were required to serve him in battle and to provide him with an army. The powerful warriors hired soldiers who were all loyal to them, and through each of them to the tribal chieftain. They were also responsible for administering tribal justice. If a powerful warrior had a territory that was too large to control himself, he subdivided it and apportioned smaller parcels to less powerful warriors. These less powerful warriors also hired soldiers and had smaller armies. When summoned, they provided their smaller armies to the more powerful warriors to whom they owed allegiance. They, too, were responsible for administering tribal justice and owed their allegiance to the tribal chieftain. Over time, for reasons we'll explore later, tribal chieftain assumed the title of king. The powerful warriors now called themselves nobles and got what were called titles of nobility from their king, which were sanctioned by the Roman Catholic Church. They now relied on knights to fight for them, thus giving the knights a greater share of power in the feudal structure. This model only shows 3 levels in a feudal pyramid. In reality, feudal power structures were much larger and more complicated than what I can show here. Sometimes, instead of a noble family, the lord of the land was a group of Catholic clergy. Clerical communities were either male or female, and the clerical leader served as the local lord. Eventually, clerical lords no longer fought in battle or had knights in their service. Clerically controlled manors played an enormous role in medieval Europe, even though they eventually no longer participated actively in battle. By the end of the Middle Ages, clerical communities controlled up to 1/3 to 1/2 of the arable land. By the way, arable land is acreage that can be cultivated, as opposed to forests, swamps, or mountains where farming was impossible. Most people living in Europe worked on manors because they provided protection against barbarian invaders. Over the Middle Ages, the barbarians were less likely to be Germanic tribes and more likely to be Vikings or Huns. Manors also provided food in times of shortage. Manors contained a stronghold, usually the manor house, where the lord of the land lived with his or her family, or the religious leader lived with his community. Strongholds had imposing walls that protected those inside. So too did most medieval churches, like this one, which still stands in England today. Of course, one had to get to the strongholds from the village or the fields before the barbarians arrived. The basis for feudalism was a contract according to which a non-noble family would agree to cultivate crops on a manor. These workers were called serfs. The feudal contract spelled out their obligations: never to leave the manor without permission from the lord of the land, to cultivate the land allotted to them, to pay the lord of the land a percentage of the crops, usually more than 50% of the yield, and to obey the lord of the land or his or her representative. Serfs had to agree never to hunt in the forest or forage for wood without permission, and never to fish in any river or stream, all of which remained for the private use of the lord of the manor. Additionally, serfs agreed to pay 1/10 of their yield for the upkeep of the local church and priest. The feudal contract also pertained to the lord of the manor, and spelled out his or her obligations. The lord had to protect the serfs with his or her private army, which he or she paid, trained, and accoutred out of his or her own personal expenses. The lord of the land was also obligated to provide for the defense and upkeep of the local church, and to mete out the king's justice, which meant that all civil and criminal cases were decided by the local lord. It is important to remember that medieval lords did not own their manors outright. They enjoyed the fruits of the manor and controlled it for as long as the king allowed them, or so long as no one captured it and took it away by right of conquest. The feudal contract was formalized by a religious oath between the lord of the land and the serfs, which meant that only Christians could participate in feudalism. The contract was considered to be binding for perpetuity, that means forever, or until the extinction of the family of either contracting parts. Thus, the children of serfs remained serfs, while the eldest surviving son of the lord of the land was the next lord, or, in some areas, the manor was divided equally among the male heirs, or even among both male and female heirs. If a lord's other sons did not inherit the manor, they might become knights or members of the clergy. The daughters of a lord would either be married off to other lords, or they would enter religious life as nuns. Feudalism was the backbone of the European economy and society for the next 600 to 1,000 years, with the system lasting longer in the eastern parts of Europe than in western parts. Despite the importance of feudalism, a rival socio-economic system developed in its shadows and gradually grew until it overtook feudalism by the 17th century, at least in England, and in the rest of the west of Europe by the 18th century. This rival system was called capitalism. It originated in medieval cities. Cities in the Middle Ages were autonomous socioeconomic entities. Medieval city dwellers are normally called burghers, a term you will see in the book, and bourgeois, a synonym that derives from the French language, which you may recognize as being in use today. All medieval cities were defined by their defensive walls and a militia drawn from the burghers. The walls protected the city, and the militia policed it. The burghers, or bourgeois, included merchants, artisans, and freemen. Artisans were workers in a skilled trade who made products with their hands. Freemen were burghers who were neither merchants nor artisans. Clergy and nobles often lived in cities, especially in the later Middle Ages, but they were not burghers because their status derived from feudalism and not from the city. Merchants, artisans, and freemen instead all had social roles based on their belonging to the city, and thus did not have any relationship within feudalism. They paid taxes for the city's administration. According to their social function and wealth, they contributed to civic life and the defense of the city. Over time, many serfs saw advantages in belonging to a city, and since cities were often looking for new members, if serfs could flee to a city and remain there a year and a day, they became freemen. As trade increased in Europe, the cities rivaled and overtook the manors in importance. By the 16th century, cities became so important that monarchs everywhere in Europe moved from the countryside to live, at least part of the year, in major cities. There, the monarch partook in a growing urban consumer society and controlled the power of the city with their presence, subsuming it under monarchical power. The wealth of cities derived from trade and artisanal activities. Trade and artisanal activities were run and organized by guilds. Guilds were local trade and artisanal organizations. For example, there were guilds in every city for weavers, dyers, masons, architects, goldsmiths, silversmiths, blacksmiths, shoemakers, leather makers, merchants, bankers, butchers, and so on. Like everything else in the Middle Ages, guilds had both a political and religious nature. They also had a rigid structure. They were organized by city. One was a member of a guild in a given city or group of cities. Since merchants had to travel from city to city, merchant guilds in one city made treaties with merchant guilds in other cities so that they could carry out long-distance trade. Artisanal guilds usually could not operate outside the city where the guild was located. All guilds were organized by a single trade. No one could participate in a trade without the guild's permission. Each guild had a charter. The guild charter was both a political and religious document. It stipulated the rules under which the guild ran a particular trade in a particular city or cities. To become a guild member, one had to be a Catholic, and membership was usually restricted to men. The charter spelled out the process for becoming a guild member. A person started at the lowliest position as an apprentice, normally as a child, and worked one's way up the ladder to become, hopefully, a master. A board of masters ran each guild. They policed the local trade, established prices, set quality controls, and sponsored civic activities for guild members and the other inhabitants in the city. While in practice medieval society was divided between a feudal countryside and a few cities where capitalist enterprises were located, legally society was structured as a society of order or estates. Orders and estates are groups that are defined by their function in society. Medieval society was divided into three orders: those who prayed, that is, the Roman Catholic clergy, also called the First Estate; those who fought, that is, the nobility, also called the Second Estate; and those who worked, that is, everyone else, also called the Third Estate. Power and wealth were concentrated in the clergy and the nobility, which made up roughly 10% of the population. Normally, people were born into both the nobility and the third estate. One left the second or third estate to join the clergy, a choice usually made by the family because it meant that the boy or girl would not have any heirs, since Catholic religious did not marry, and because enrolling a child in a clerical organization was quite expensive. The medieval state was very different from its Roman counterpart. Instead of a strong centralized state under a single imperial authority, the medieval world was made up of relatively small rival territorial kingdoms. The medieval state was a hybrid Germanic and Roman political and religious structure. It was a fusion of the German concept of the tribe and the Roman concept of the populus. The word populus is best understood as an approximation of the modern American term we the people, or by the nation. For the Romans, the populus consisted of the citizenry of Rome. According to the famous Latin formula, Rome consisted of the populus and the Senate. No one else was a citizen or mattered beyond these two groups. The Germanic tribes altered the meaning of populus by equating it with their tribe. Their tribe became we the people, or the nation. This change had a fundamental impact on the course of human events. It equated the citizenry and the tribe as a single political entity. According to Germanic law, membership in the tribe was determined by patrilineal descent. Patrilineal descent in Germanic law meant that to belong to the tribe, one's father had to be a member. Non-members, even those who might have married into the tribe, remained outsiders with no rights, unless they were granted the privilege to marry into the tribe so they could live among it. This privilege and any others could only be granted by the tribal chieftain, or later the monarch, and these privileges were granted solely for special reasons that were considered to benefit the chieftain or monarch, and oftentimes the whole society. This medieval concept of society is essential for understanding what happened to Jewish communities in Europe over the next 1,000 years. Jews who were invited to settle there were never allowed to become members of European society. They remained foreigners, even in the rare circumstances when they assimilated. If a monarch changed his or her mind about Jews living in his or her kingdom, even on a whim, or if a monarch forgot about privileges granted by his or her predecessors, the privileges were denied, lost, or forgotten, and the Jews faced the confiscation of their property and expulsion. Members of the subordinate and elite classes were also likely to become jealous of privileges granted to Jews. Moreover, they might question why the monarch had given privileges to Jews, especially when they were taught that Jews were in league with the devil. The problem for Jews as permanent outsiders was compounded by their small number and their inability to protect themselves against more numerous and more powerful enemies. So, a major part of our story over the next 1,000 years is predicated on your understanding that the Jews occupied a liminal space in European society. In case you do not know how I'm using the word liminal, here it means occupying a position at the boundary or threshold of society. Jews remain outsiders, the other in Catholic Europe, no matter how long they lived there, and no matter whether they had lived longer in a given place than other Christians. The Jews' existence in Europe was thus defined by ambiguity. They were permitted to live in Europe, but they were hated for it. Next, let's take a closer look at the Germanic kingdoms that sprang up in Europe, where Jews were slowly invited to settle. Where possible, European kingdoms developed within natural boundaries, or within the geographical limits set by their leaders' exercise of power. In general, the stronger the tribal group, or populus, the larger the kingdom. The Roman Catholic Church became a powerful ally in the Germanic kings' efforts to create a stable kingdom. Catholic leaders had two primary motivations. One, they were anxious to spread their religion, and two, they recognized the many advantages for the Catholic Church in converting kings to their form of Christianity. As monarchs converted, often for political reasons, so too did other elites. Thereafter, the rest of the tribe was forced to convert, often at the edge of a sword, and often not without resistance. This historical process in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages transformed Europe into a Christian area of the world. I next want to take you on a brief geographical tour of the European continent, the Mediterranean, and Western Asia in the Middle Ages to give you an idea of the areas to which Jews moved. You do not need to memorize these maps. The boundaries and the names of the European kingdoms were extremely fluid and complicated. Instead, I want you to get a general sense of the main contours of Europe from the 9th to the 14th century. By the 9th century, a period we will explore in our next case study, Europe was dominated in the north by a large Frankish kingdom which called itself the Holy Roman Empire. Despite its name, it was a Germanic kingdom. It had a hybrid Germanic-Roman culture that was more Germanic than Roman. It sought unsuccessfully to resurrect the Western Roman Empire. Still, it did last for another 1,000 years. Further north were the British Isles and Ireland. In the south of Europe was the Papal States. Here the Bishop of Rome ruled as the Pope King. The dominant culture in the Papal States was more Roman than Germanic because of its proximity to the former center of the Roman Empire and its distance from the major thrust of Germanic penetration. Outside of Catholic Europe, we find what was left of the Roman Empire, also called the Byzantine Empire. It, too, was a Christian area, but the people did not recognize the primacy of the Pope. Instead, they called themselves Orthodox Christians, and their leader lived in Constantinople. The rest of the Mediterranean basin was occupied by expanding Muslim states. Notice how they occupied the southern and eastern Mediterranean and the Iberian Peninsula. Most of the Iberian Peninsula became a Muslim society until the end of the 15th century. Next, let's move to the 10th century. Notice how the large Frankish kingdom fractured into smaller states. Catholicism spread with the conversion of tribes in the far northern parts of the continent and into large pockets of Eastern Europe and Western Asia. Outside of Catholic Europe, the Roman Empire contracted further, and Muslim kingdoms expanded. By the 12th century, the Holy Roman Empire dominated Central Europe. By now, it was a confederation of Germanic kings, princes, and bishops. As we shall see, this area would become home to a large proportion of European Jews. Catholic Europe expanded with the conversion of more of Eastern Europe and Western Asia. Notice, for instance, the creation of a large Polish kingdom, which we will study in some detail, and the beginnings of a Christian Russia, further east. Because Russia was converted by missionaries from Constantinople, most of the people in Russia became Christian Orthodox, not Roman Catholic. Finally, let's skip to the 14th century. The Holy Roman Empire continued to dominate Central Europe. England, Scotland, and Ireland assumed contours that should be familiar to you. By contrast, the Roman Empire had contracted even more and was on the verge of collapse. Its fall would occur in 1453. Notice, too, how the political and religious map of the Iberian Peninsula was changing. The Catholic monarchs of Castile and Aragon were dislodging the Muslims from Spain, a process that would conclude at the end of the 15th century, which we will study. Next, let's examine more closely the transformation of European monarchies over the Middle Ages. In the early part, European monarchs ruled in what they thought was a Roman style of kingship, thus strengthening the hybridization of Germanic and Roman culture. Dissatisfied with their inferior position compared to the Roman emperor, and unable to compete with him for his title, European kings looked for other ways to augment their standing. While brute force always remained an option, European monarchs increasingly looked to Catholicism to strengthen their status. And, curiously, they drew from Catholicism's roots in Judaism and the Jewish model of kingship in particular. Medieval monarchs had several reasons for borrowing from Judaism to develop different styles of kingship from the ones that had emerged in late antiquity. First, the position of the Roman emperor was not as stable as we might assume. Although it often remained within the same clan, family members murdered each other with frightening ease in order to seize the imperial throne. Later Roman emperors were, more often than not, unrelated by blood to their predecessors. Second, Germanic kingship was elective. The strongest warriors chose the next leader or fought among themselves to determine the successor. Third, European monarchs increasingly sought to pass their thrones to one of their children after they died. And fourth, they had no way of enforcing their will once they were dead. If they wanted a hereditary monarchy, something clearly had to change. Aping the ancient Israelite and Jewish monarchies offered a way to establish a hereditary form of government. Israelite and Jewish forms of monarchy were, for the most part, hereditary. Succession followed a male line of descent. According to this model, the eldest son of the king had the greatest claim to succeed his father, followed by his children by order of birth, and then the younger sons of the king and their children, again by order of birth. If none of the king's children could assume the throne, the king's more distant relatives had stronger claims than non-relatives. Equally important was the supposed consent of the God of Abraham. This consent was thought to manifest itself in several ways. The most convincing way was for the God to make its will known through a prophet. If no prophet were available to point out God's choice for king, it became acceptable to see the king's bloodline as the will of the God of Abraham. After all, if, as the Israelites and Jews believed, everything that happened was the will of their God, then the birth of a child to a king was also divine will. God's choice was made manifest with the king's consecration with holy oil during the coronation ceremony. The holy oil marked the king permanently as the person God had selected to lead the chosen people. If there were a prophet alive at the coronation, he would do the anointing. In the absence of a prophet, the high priest, the leader of the order of priests among the Israelites and Jews, would do it. Of course, the notion that the choice for king had to be pleasing to God meant that the king had to remain so throughout his reign. Proof of a king's legitimacy and righteousness was manifested by the Jewish God's supposed granting the king a successful reign. If the Israelite or Jewish kingdom suffered a major defeat, or if the chosen people suffered a terrible misfortune, widespread misery, or death, many saw the king's sins as a probable cause. Put another way, the Israelites and the Jews believed that the whole chosen people would be punished if an illegitimate person were made king, or if a legitimate king seriously transgressed their God's commandments. Of course, you can imagine that this form of kingship presented some fundamental problems. Who got to decide that a major defeat for the Israelites, a king's sudden death, or other misfortune befalling the chosen people was a punishment from the God of Abraham? Only the hindsight of history, from the perspective of later generations, could lead one to conclude that a king had been removed or the nation had suffered because of the God of Abraham's displeasure. Fortunately, the Bible served this purpose for the Jews, and the Old Testament now for Christians. The Bible contains historical narratives that taught lessons about kingship and society, about how the chosen people found favor with the God of Abraham and prospered, and about how the chosen people fell out of God's favor and suffered, because of something they did or because of something their king did. The Christian adoption and adaptation of Israelite and Jewish forms of kingship had another appeal. You will recall that during the 1st century CE, many Jews expected the imminent appearance of a Messiah. Many believed that the Messiah would come as a king, who would drive out the ancient Romans who were occupying the kingdom of Judea, overthrow Herod and his religious and political supporters who had sold out the Jewish nation to the Romans, and establish a new Jewish kingdom. Although Jesus had never claimed the title of the King of the Jews as his own, many of his followers thought he was a Messiah in this sense, which was the reason why the Romans crucified him as a rabble-rouser. Moreover, according to Christian myth, Pontius Pilate had testified to Jesus' status as king in a special sense by placing a placard over Jesus' dying body indicating that he was King of the Jews. For medieval society, Jesus thus became Christ the King of the new chosen people. By adopting the Jewish model of kingship, understood in the Middle Ages as having passed through the person of Jesus, European monarchs created the powerful message that they embodied Jesus as both a political and religious leader of their medieval Christian nation. The medieval conception of kingship had another important consequence. For Europeans, the monarch stood as the latest in a line of monarchs who originated with the Israelites and passed through Jesus to the Middle Ages, just as the tribe stood as both heir to the Roman idea of the populus and we the people, a nation related by blood. Together the European monarch and the nation were the New Jerusalem, the new chosen people. This formula relegated the Jews to a liminal space as the other, which 5th century Christian antisemitism had first forced them into. Theologically and politically, Jews never belonged in medieval Europe, except to contribute their knowledge and expertise to the political, cultural, and social economic well-being of European kingdoms. And herein lay a contradiction. The presence of the Jews in Europe was only possible by a monarch's ability to use his or her power to grant Jews the privilege to live and work in Europe and to protect them from other Christians. Other Christians saw little to no advantage in allowing the Jews to live amongst them, because as the Catholic Church taught, Jews were responsible for killing Jesus and forever cursed. They were a people possessed by Satan and out to destroy the Christian world. To create this new kind of kingship and society, European monarchs had to convince the most authoritative local Catholic leader in their kingdom to anoint them king. The Pope was the optimum candidate, given the Pope's position as head of the Catholic Church. However, since travel was difficult, it usually was impossible for monarchs to get the Pope to consecrate them, so monarchs would have to make do with the most important bishop in their realm. They also needed a religiously significant and majestic place for their coronation ceremonies. Holy Roman emperors constructed the Palatine Chapel in the Germanic city of Aachen for their coronations from the 10th to the 16th century. French kings selected Reims Cathedral from the 12th to the 18th century. Analogous choices were made by the other European monarchs. Thus we find a transformation of the state and society from Augustus Caesar's pre-Christian Rome to Constantine's Christian Rome, and from Christian Rome to Catholic Europe. This cultural and political transformation purposely excluded the Jews, even as Catholic monarchs asked them to settle in their kingdoms for socioeconomic reasons, but would later expel them when it was no longer expedient for them to allow the Jews to remain. As we consider the history of Catholic Europe and the migration of Jews into this area of the world, we will explore how the Middle Ages reinforced older forms of anti-Semitism and developed newer ones.